Case 1. Heather Presty, the angel of death in Scrubs. When healthcare becomes homicide. The fluorescent lights of nursing homes across southwestern Pennsylvania cast sterile shadows over residents in their final years of life. These should be places of comfort, dignity, and care. Between 2008 and 2023, they became hunting grounds for one of America's most prolific serial killers, a woman who wore scrubs instead of a mask, who wielded insulin instead of a weapon, and who smiled while she murdered. Heather Presty seemed like the ideal nurse. Dedicated, attentive, always volunteering for extra shifts. But behind her professional facade lurked something monstrous. A woman who would ultimately be charged with killing 17 people and attempting to kill 19 more, making her one of the deadliest healthcare serial killers in American history. The investigation begins. It started with a pattern that should have been caught years earlier. Elderly patients under Presty's care were dying unexpectedly, not from their existing conditions, not from natural causes. They were dying from massive insulin overdoses, their blood sugar levels plummeting to near zero as their bodies went into shock. In May of 2023, investigators finally connected the dots. Heather Presty had worked at multiple facilities across Butler and Beaver counties. And everywhere she went, death followed. Quality Life Services in Butler became ground zero for the investigation. Residents who had been stable for months suddenly crashed while under Presty's watch. Security footage would later show her entering patient rooms with syringes, staying just long enough to administer fatal doses, then calmly walking away as alarms began to sound. The method. Presty's weapon of choice was insulin, a medication that, in proper doses, saves lives. In her hands, it became a silent killer. She would inject massive quantities into patients who weren't even diabetic, sending them into hypoglycemic shock. Their bodies would seize. Their organs would fail. And by the time other staff members rushed to help, the damage was done. What made Presty particularly dangerous was her medical knowledge. She knew exactly how much insulin would kill. She knew how quickly it would act. And she knew that in elderly patients with multiple health conditions, her murders might look like natural deaths, if anyone bothered to look closely. But investigators did look closely. When they examined medical records from Presty's 15-year nursing career, they found a trail of bodies stretching back over a decade. 17 confirmed murders, 19 attempted murders, and potentially dozens more that may never be definitively proven. The victims. Let's be clear about who Heather Presty killed. These weren't statistics. They were grandparents, great-grandparents, people who had served their country, raised families, built communities. They trusted the healthcare system to care for them in their most vulnerable years. 89-year-old residents who had survived the Great Depression and World War II, only to be murdered by someone sworn to protect them. Veterans who had faced enemy fire abroad, only to be killed in their own beds by a trusted caregiver. Mothers and fathers who had lived full, rich lives, now reduced to line items in a serial killer's horrifying tally. Each victim had family members who visited them, who trusted that their loved ones were in good hands. Instead, they were paying for their family members to be systematically murdered. The psychology. What creates a healthcare serial killer? Experts call it angel of death syndrome, a God complex where medical professionals believe they have the right to decide who lives and who dies. Some claim they're ending suffering. Others crave the power and control. Presty offered no such justifications. Her motive remains chillingly unclear. She didn't confess to mercy killings. She didn't claim she was ending suffering. She simply killed, again and again, with cold efficiency. Prosecutors believe she experienced what criminal psychologists call homicidal ideation, intrusive thoughts about killing that, in most people, remain just thoughts. But in Presty, these thoughts found action. And once she crossed that line, once she discovered she could kill without immediate detection, she couldn't stop. The arrest and charges. In May of 2023, Pennsylvania State Police arrived at Presty's home with an arrest warrant. She showed no emotion as they read her rights. No tears. No protests of innocence. Just cold, clinical detachment, the same demeanor she'd maintained while killing her patients. The charges were staggering. 17 counts of first-degree murder. 19 counts of attempted murder. Multiple counts of neglect and abuse. If Pennsylvania still had the death penalty, prosecutors would have sought it without hesitation. Attorney General Michelle Henry held a press conference that sent shockwaves through Pennsylvania's healthcare system. This defendant exploited her position as a trusted caregiver to commit unspeakable acts, Henry stated. She betrayed not just her victims, but every patient who depends on medical professionals to do no harm. The legal proceedings. Presti's defense team faced an impossible task. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Medical records showed unexplained insulin administrations. Security footage placed her in patient rooms moments before crashes. Toxicology reports revealed massive insulin levels in non-diabetic patients. In January of 2025, rather than face a trial where every horrifying detail would be presented to a jury, Heather Presti accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to murdering 17 people, becoming one of the most prolific serial killers in Pennsylvania history. The sentencing hearing was devastating. Family members of victims filled the courtroom, many clutching photographs of their lost loved ones. They spoke of birthdays that would never be celebrated, of holidays forever marked by absence, of the violation of trust that made their grief even more unbearable. Judge ordered 17 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Even if she lives to be 100, Heather Presti will die in prison, a small measure of justice for the 17 lives she stole and the 19 people she tried to kill. The systemic failures. But here's what should terrify every American with a loved one in a care facility. Heather Presti operated for 15 years across multiple facilities. How was this possible? The investigation revealed catastrophic failures at every level. Facilities didn't properly investigate unexplained deaths. Staff members who noticed suspicious patterns were dismissed or ignored. Background checks failed to catch concerning patterns as Presti moved from facility to facility. Pennsylvania's healthcare oversight system had failed spectacularly, and Presti knew it. She exploited every weakness, every gap, every blind spot in a system that should have stopped her years earlier. In response, Pennsylvania lawmakers introduced emergency legislation requiring enhanced oversight of nursing home deaths, mandatory reporting of suspicious patterns, and stricter background checks for healthcare workers. But for 17 families, these reforms came too late. Current status. Today, Heather Presti sits in the State Correctional Institution at Muncie, Pennsylvania's prison for female inmates serving long sentences. She's 41 years old. She will die there, decades from now, having spent more of her life in prison than she spent free. She maintains no contact with former colleagues. Inmates know what she did, and even in prison, where many are serving time for violent crimes, healthcare serial killers are viewed as particularly monstrous. Heather Presti's case stands as one of the darkest chapters in Pennsylvania's criminal history. A trusted nurse who became one of America's most prolific serial killers. A woman who violated the most sacred oath in medicine. First, do no harm. Case 2. Lisa Snyder, the mother who killed her children. A tragedy too horrible to comprehend. There are crimes that shake your faith in humanity. And then there are crimes so incomprehensible, so fundamentally wrong, that they seem to violate the very laws of nature itself. What Lisa Snyder did to her children on September 23, 2019, falls into this second category. The 911 call. It was 4:45 in the afternoon when Lisa Snyder called 911 from her home in Albany Township, Berks County, Pennsylvania. Her voice was frantic. "My kids. I found them in the basement. They're hanging. Please help." First responders raced to the modest home on Creek Road. What they found would haunt them for the rest of their lives. 8-year-old Connor Snyder and 4-year-old Brinley Snyder, hanging from a wire wrapped around an exposed beam in the unfinished basement. Both children were unresponsive. Paramedics worked desperately to revive them. Connor and Brinley were rushed to Lehigh Valley Hospital, Cedar Crest. But the damage was catastrophic. Their young brains had been deprived of oxygen for too long. Connor died 3 days later, on September 26th. Little Brinley held on for 3 more agonizing days before she passed on September 29th. 2 innocent children, gone. And their mother's story about what happened to them was about to fall completely apart. The mother's story. Lisa Snyder told investigators a story that was disturbing even if it had been true. She claimed that 8-year-old Connor had been severely bullied at school. According to Snyder, the bullying had become so intense that Connor had told her he wanted to die. She claimed she had come home that afternoon to find both children hanging in the basement, that Connor had created this elaborate suicide setup and somehow convinced his 4-year-old sister to die with him. It was a story designed to evoke sympathy. A tragic tale of a bullied child driven to suicide who, in his disturbed state, had taken his baby sister with him. A heartbroken mother who had lost everything. There was just one problem. None of it was true. The investigation. From the very beginning, something didn't add up. Pennsylvania State Police investigators and forensic experts began examining every detail of the scene, and the holes in Lisa Snyder's story grew wider by the hour. First, the physical evidence. The wire used in the hanging was tied with complex knots that would have been nearly impossible for an 8-year-old to create, let alone a distraught child attempting suicide. The positioning of the wire, the height of the beam, the setup itself, all pointed to adult involvement. Second, investigators contacted Connor's school. Teachers, counselors, administrators. None had any reports of bullying. None had noticed any behavioral changes suggesting depression or suicidal ideation. Connor's classmates described him as a happy, normal child. The bullying story was a complete fabrication. Third, forensic analysis of Lisa Snyder's phone and computer revealed disturbing searches in the days before the children died. She had researched hanging methods. She had looked up information about children and suicide. She had searched for details about life insurance policies. But perhaps most damning, security camera footage from a neighbor's home showed that only Lisa Snyder's vehicle was present at the house during the time frame when the children died. No one else had been there. No intruder. No mysterious figure. Just a mother and her 2 children. The charges. On December 9, 2019, Pennsylvania State Police arrested Lisa Snyder. The charges were among the most serious possible under Pennsylvania law. 2 counts of first-degree murder. 2 counts of endangering the welfare of children. 1 count of tampering with evidence. District Attorney John Adams held a press conference that captured the community's horror. These children did not die by their own hands. They were murdered by the one person who should have protected them above all others, their mother. The motive. Why would a mother kill her own children? Investigators believe they found the answer in Lisa Snyder's desperate financial situation and failing relationship. Snyder was drowning in debt. She had lost multiple jobs. Her relationship with the children's father had deteriorated. She was behind on bills, facing potential eviction. In her twisted logic, killing her children became the solution to her problems. But there may have been an even darker motive: life insurance. Investigators discovered that Snyder had recently purchased life insurance policies on both children. The payouts would have been substantial, enough to solve her immediate financial crisis. The psychological profile that emerged was chilling. Lisa Snyder saw her children not as human beings with their own rights to life, but as possessions, problems to be eliminated when they became inconvenient. The victims, Connor and Brinley. Let's remember who these children were before their mother took everything from them. Connor Snyder was 8 years old. He loved video games and superheroes. He was starting 3rd grade, learning multiplication, making friends. He had his whole life ahead of him. First loves, graduation, career, family. His mother stole all of it. Brinley Snyder was just 4 years old. She was learning to write her name. She loved princesses and playing dress-up. She trusted her mother completely. That trust was betrayed in the most horrific way imaginable. These weren't just statistics. They were children with hopes, dreams, and unlimited potential. Lisa Snyder didn't just kill 2 people. She destroyed 2 entire futures. The community response. Albany Township, a quiet community in Berks County, was devastated. Neighbors had seen Lisa with her children. Many had believed her initial story about bullying and suicide. The truth was almost too horrible to accept. A memorial appeared outside the Snyder home. Teddy bears, flowers, candles, and notes from community members mourning children they'd never met, but whose deaths touched them profoundly. "Angels too pure for this world," read one note. If only the person who wrote it knew how close to the truth they were. These children were too pure for the evil that lived in their own home. The children's father, who had not been living with the family, was cleared of any involvement. His grief was genuine and overwhelming. He had lost his children to their own mother, a betrayal beyond comprehension. The legal battle. Lisa Snyder's trial was delayed multiple times as her defense team struggled to find any strategy that might work. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Her own internet searches, the physical impossibility of her story, the absence of any bullying, the life insurance policies. Her attorneys initially suggested she might have been suffering from mental illness, that perhaps she'd experienced a psychotic break. But psychiatric evaluations found her legally sane and fully aware of her actions. She knew what she was doing. She knew it was wrong. She did it anyway. The prosecution built an airtight case. They brought in forensic experts who demonstrated that an 8-year-old could not have created the hanging setup. They presented testimony from teachers and school officials debunking the bullying narrative. They showed the jury Lisa Snyder's internet searches, her financial desperation, and the life insurance policies she'd purchased on her children. The verdict and sentencing. In late 2024, a Berks County jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with their verdict, guilty on all counts. First-degree murder for both Connor and Brinley Snyder. The sentencing phase was emotionally devastating. The children's father delivered a victim impact statement that left the courtroom in tears. "She didn't just kill my children," he said, his voice breaking. "She killed every dream I had for them. Every birthday party. Every graduation. Every grandchild I'll never hold. She killed my entire future." The judge showed no mercy. Pennsylvania law mandates life without parole for first-degree murder convictions. Lisa Snyder received 2 consecutive life sentences, meaning even if one conviction were somehow overturned, she would still die in prison for the other. "These children were gifts," the judge stated during sentencing, "and you threw them away like they were nothing. You will have decades to contemplate what you've done, but you will do it behind bars. You will never know freedom again." Current status. Lisa Snyder is currently incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution at Muncie, Pennsylvania's maximum security prison for women serving long sentences. She is 41 years old. She will die there, many decades from now, having spent the majority of her life in prison for murdering her own children. She has shown no remorse. In the 5 years since Connor and Brinley's deaths, she has maintained her innocence despite overwhelming evidence of her guilt. Even fellow inmates, many serving time for violent crimes themselves, view her with disgust. In the hierarchy of prison, child killers occupy the absolute bottom. The case of Lisa Snyder reminds us that the most dangerous monsters aren't strangers lurking in shadows. Sometimes, they're the people children call mommy, the very people who should protect them above all else. Connor and Brinley Snyder deserved a mother who loved them. Instead, they got Lisa Snyder. And that made all the difference between life and death. Case 3. Trin Gwynn. When a mother's love turns deadly. The Chesterbrook murder-suicide that shocked Delaware County. The morning of May 13, 2018, started like any other in the upscale Chesterbrook neighborhood of Chester County, Pennsylvania. Children were getting ready for school. Parents were preparing for work. Minivans and SUVs lined the driveways of well-maintained homes where families lived out their version of the American dream. Inside one particular home on Waterman Drive, 2 boys should have been getting ready for school. 12-year-old Nelson Gwynn and 9-year-old Jeffrey Gwynn should have been eating breakfast, gathering their backpacks, maybe arguing over who got to sit in the front seat on the ride to school. Instead, both boys were dead, strangled by their own mother. And Trin Gwynn was about to make sure authorities found her children by setting her house on fire with their bodies inside. The 911 call. At approximately 6:45 in the morning, neighbors reported smoke billowing from the Gwynn residence. Firefighters from the Eagle Fire Company arrived within minutes, their engines screaming through the quiet suburban streets. They found the 2-story home fully engulfed. Flames were shooting through the roof. The heat was so intense, it was melting the vinyl siding on neighboring houses. This wasn't just a house fire. This was an inferno deliberately set to destroy evidence. After battling the blaze for over an hour, firefighters made their way inside. What they discovered turned a fire investigation into a homicide case. 2 young boys, deceased, in an upstairs bedroom. Initial examination suggested they had died before the fire started. This was no tragic accident. This was murder. And then, in a bathroom, firefighters made another discovery. Trin Gwynn herself, still alive, but suffering from smoke inhalation and self-inflicted cuts. She had tried to kill herself after murdering her children and setting the fire. She had failed. The investigation. As Trin Nguyen recovered at Paoli Hospital under police guard, investigators began piecing together the horrifying events of that morning. The medical examiner determined that both Nelson and Jeffrey had been manually strangled, killed by sustained pressure on their necks that cut off blood flow to their brains. This wasn't a moment of rage. This was calculated, deliberate murder that took several minutes per child. The fire had been set deliberately, using accelerants in multiple locations throughout the house. Trin Nguyen had wanted to destroy the evidence, to make it look like her children had died in an accidental fire. But the flames hadn't burned hot enough or long enough to hide the truth. Detectives searched through what remained of the home and discovered something chilling. A note, partially burned but still legible. In it, Trin Nguyen expressed despair over her failing marriage and financial troubles. She wrote that she couldn't bear to leave her children behind, so she had decided they would all leave together. It was a murder-suicide note, except Trin Nguyen had survived. The background. On the surface, the Nguyen family seemed successful. They lived in an affluent neighborhood. The boys attended good schools. Both parents had professional careers. But beneath this veneer of success, the family was crumbling. Trin Nguyen's marriage was failing. Her husband had moved out, and divorce proceedings had begun. Financial pressures were mounting. She was facing the prospect of losing the lifestyle she had worked so hard to achieve. The house, the neighborhood, the image of success. But here's what made Trin Nguyen different from other people facing similar struggles. She couldn't accept that her children would be better off without her. She couldn't conceive of a world where she wasn't in control of their lives. Friends and neighbors were shocked. They described Trin as a devoted mother who seemed to dote on her boys. But investigators discovered a darker pattern. Trin Nguyen was controlling and possessive. The boys weren't just her children. They were extensions of herself, possessions she owned. The psychology of familicide. What Trin Nguyen committed is classified by criminologists as filicide suicide, when a parent kills their children and then attempts or completes suicide. It's thankfully rare, but devastatingly final when it occurs. Experts identify several types of filicide. Altruistic filicide, where the parent believes they're saving the child from a worse fate. Acutely psychotic filicide, driven by hallucinations or delusions. Unwanted child filicide, where the child is seen as a burden. Accidental filicide, where abuse escalates to death. Spouse revenge filicide, where one parent kills the children to hurt the other parent. Trin Nguyen's crime appears to fall into the first category, altruistic filicide. She claimed she was saving her children from the pain of the divorce, from the disruption of their lives, from a future she couldn't control. But let's be absolutely clear. There was nothing altruistic about strangling two terrified children. This was murder, pure and simple, dressed up in the language of maternal love. The victims, Nelson and Jeffrey. Nelson Nguyen was 12 years old. He was in 6th grade. He played soccer and loved video games. He was starting to think about middle school, about girls, about what he wanted to be when he grew up. His mother stole all of it from him. Jeffrey Nguyen was 9 years old. He was in 3rd grade. He still believed in superheroes. He collected Pokemon cards. He had just lost his 2 front teeth. He was at that magical age where everything seems possible and the whole world is an adventure waiting to happen. His mother decided he would never get to take that adventure. Both boys were honor students. They had friends. They had teachers who cared about them. They had a father who loved them and wanted to remain part of their lives. Yes, their parents' marriage was ending, but that's survivable. Millions of children have divorced parents and go on to live happy, successful lives. Nelson and Jeffrey Nguyen never got that chance because their mother decided her pain was more important than their lives. The arrest and charges. Once Trin Nguyen had recovered sufficiently from her injuries and smoke inhalation, she was arrested at the hospital. Chester County District Attorney Tom Hogan announced the charges: 2 counts of first-degree murder, 2 counts of third-degree murder, arson, and related offenses. This defendant made a choice, Hogan stated at a press conference. She chose to end 2 innocent lives rather than deal with the normal challenges of divorce that millions of Americans face every day. She chose murder. And now she will face justice. The community response was intense. Neighbors who had known the family held a vigil for Nelson and Jeffrey. Classmates created memorial posters. Teachers struggled to explain to other students why their friends weren't coming back to school. The boy's father, devastated beyond measure, released a statement. "My sons were my world. They were bright, kind, loving boys who had their entire lives ahead of them. I will never understand how their mother could do this. I will spend the rest of my life missing them." The legal proceedings. Trin Nguyen's defense team faced an impossible task. Their client had written a note explaining what she planned to do. She had strangled both children with her own hands. She had set the fire to cover up the murders. And she had survived to face the consequences. The defense strategy focused on mental health. They brought in psychiatrists who diagnosed Nguyen with severe depression and adjustment disorder related to her impending divorce. They argued that she had experienced a complete mental breakdown and wasn't in her right mind when she killed her sons. But the prosecution countered with their own experts who testified that while Nguyen may have been depressed, she knew exactly what she was doing. The planning involved, the note, the murders, the fire, all demonstrated clear thinking and intent. She wasn't psychotic. She wasn't hearing voices commanding her to kill. She made a conscious choice. The trial was emotionally devastating. Jurors listened to forensic evidence about how the boys died. The petechial hemorrhaging in their eyes, the bruising on their necks, the signs of struggle. They saw photos of the burned home and the children's bodies. Several jurors were seen wiping away tears. The verdict and sentencing. After a 3-week trial in 2020, the jury deliberated for 2 days before reaching their verdict, guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing hearing was particularly wrenching. The boy's father delivered a victim impact statement that was so emotional the judge had to call for a recess. Family members held up photographs of Nelson and Jeffrey at birthday parties, at school events, living their lives that had been cut short by their own mother. The judge sentenced Trin Nguyen to 2 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. "You extinguished 2 bright lights," the judge stated. "You took away not just their lives, but all the joy they would have brought to this world. You will spend the rest of your life in prison. And that is exactly what you deserve." Current status. Trin Nguyen is currently incarcerated at SCI Muncie, Pennsylvania's maximum security facility for women. She is 51 years old. She will die in prison many decades from now, having spent the rest of her life contemplating the irreversible decision she made on May 13, 2018. She has reportedly expressed remorse, though that remorse rings hollow. She told a prison counselor that she thought it was the right thing to do at the time, and that she wanted to spare them pain. What about their pain as they were being strangled? What about their terror as they realized their own mother was killing them? In prison, Trin Nguyen has kept to herself. Other inmates know what she did. Even in a population of convicted criminals, maternal filicide is viewed as particularly repugnant. The case of Trin Nguyen serves as a tragic reminder that divorce, financial problems, and personal struggles, no matter how severe, are never justification for murder. Millions of people face these challenges and find healthy ways to cope. Trin Nguyen chose murder instead, and 2 innocent boys paid the price with their lives. Case 4. Ruth Dorenzo Whitehead, a surgeon's deadly secret. When medical brilliance masks maternal murder. Great Neck, New York, an affluent community on Long Island's North Shore, is the kind of place where success stories are common. Doctors, lawyers, business executives, people who've achieved the American dream through hard work, education, and determination. Ruth Dorenzo Whitehead seemed to embody that success. A board-certified surgeon, a respected member of the medical community, a mother of 3 children. On the surface, she had everything: a thriving career, a beautiful home, a family. But on November 28, 2022, that carefully constructed facade would shatter in the most horrific way possible. And one question would haunt everyone who knew her. How could a woman who dedicated her life to saving others murder her own son? The day everything changed. Thanksgiving weekend 2022 should have been a time of family, gratitude, and togetherness for the Dorenzo Whitehead family. Instead, it became the setting for an unspeakable tragedy. On November 28th, police in Great Neck responded to a 911 call from the Dorenzo Whitehead residence. When they arrived, they found a scene of chaos. A husband frantically trying to stop his wife from committing further violence. And on the floor, bleeding from multiple stab wounds, was their 13-year-old son, Matthew Dirienzo Whitehead. Matthew was rushed to Cohen Children's Medical Center. Surgeons, Ruth's colleagues in the medical profession she had once practiced, worked desperately to save his life. But the injuries were too severe. Matthew had been stabbed multiple times in vital areas. He died from his wounds. And the person who had inflicted those wounds? His own mother, Dr. Ruth Dirienzo Whitehead. The investigation. Nassau County detectives began what should have been a straightforward investigation. After all, the stabbing occurred in the family home with witnesses present. But as they dug deeper, they uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior that had been building for months, if not years. Ruth Dirienzo Whitehead had been struggling with her medical career. She had been placed on administrative leave from her position at St. Francis Hospital in Roslyn. The reasons weren't immediately clear, but colleagues later reported concerns about her behavior and decision-making. Her marriage was deteriorating. Her husband had been contemplating separation. The family dynamics had become increasingly toxic, with Ruth becoming more controlling and erratic. But most disturbing was Ruth's relationship with Matthew. According to family members and friends, she had become obsessed with controlling every aspect of his life, his schoolwork, his friends, his activities. When Matthew, entering his teenage years, began asserting more independence, Ruth couldn't handle it. The night of November 28th, an argument had erupted over something seemingly trivial. Matthew's performance in school or his behavior at home. Accounts vary. But what started as a typical parent-teenager conflict escalated in a way no one could have predicted. Ruth Dirienzo Whitehead went to the kitchen. She grabbed a knife, and she attacked her own son with the same hands that had performed surgeries to save strangers' lives. The medical community's shock. The medical community on Long Island was stunned. Dr. Dirienzo Whitehead wasn't just any doctor. She was a surgeon, someone who had undergone years of rigorous training, someone who had taken the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. Colleagues struggled to reconcile the professional they knew with the woman who had murdered her own child. Some reported that they'd noticed changes in her behavior, increased stress, anxiety, mood swings. But no one had imagined she was capable of violence, let alone murdering her son. The hospital where she had worked released a carefully worded statement expressing sympathy for the victim and his family, while noting that Dirienzo Whitehead was no longer affiliated with their institution. The medical board immediately suspended her license, a formality, given that she would never practice medicine again. The victim, Matthew Dirienzo Whitehead. Matthew was 13 years old. He was in 8th grade. He loved sports and video games. He was starting to think about high school, about his future, about what kind of person he wanted to become. He was at that awkward, wonderful age where childhood is fading and young adulthood is beginning. Friends described him as funny and kind, someone who made people laugh. Teachers said he was a good student who was engaged in his classes. He had his whole life ahead of him. First love, graduation, college, career, maybe a family of his own someday. All of that was stolen by his own mother in a moment of incomprehensible violence. Matthew's siblings, 2 other children whose names have been kept private, lost not only their brother but, in a sense, both parents that day. Their mother became a murderer. Their father became a widower, grieving the loss of his son and the destruction of his family. The psychological profile. What drove a successful surgeon to murder her own child? Forensic psychiatrists who examined Ruth Dirienzo Whitehead identified several factors. Narcissistic personality traits. Ruth saw her children, particularly Matthew, as extensions of herself rather than as individuals with their own identities. When Matthew began asserting independence, she experienced it as a personal betrayal. Control issues. As a surgeon, Ruth was accustomed to being in complete control of life and death situations. She couldn't accept that she couldn't control her teenage son's behavior and choices. Professional stress and identity crisis. The loss of her medical career had destabilized Ruth's sense of self. She had invested so much of her identity in being a surgeon that when that was taken away, she spiraled. Possible substance abuse. There were suggestions, though never proven in court, that Ruth may have been abusing prescription medications, which could have impaired her judgment. But none of these factors, individually or collectively, justify what she did. Millions of parents deal with professional stress, control issues, and challenging teenagers without resorting to murder. The charges and legal proceedings. Ruth Durienza Whitehead was arrested at the scene and charged with second-degree murder. Given the circumstances, the stabbing occurred during a domestic dispute with no premeditation. Prosecutors determined that first-degree murder charges weren't appropriate. But second-degree murder in New York carries a sentence of 15 years to life. Her defense attorneys faced the same impossible challenge that every defender of a maternal filicide faces. How do you defend the indefensible? They focused on mental health, arguing that Ruth had experienced a psychotic break brought on by the stress of losing her career and her deteriorating marriage. But prosecutors countered that Ruth's actions, while horrific, showed clear intent. She had gone to the kitchen, selected a weapon, and used it with lethal force against her son. This wasn't a psychotic break. This was murder. The case never went to trial. In late 2023, Ruth Durienza Whitehead accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for prosecutors agreeing not to pursue the maximum sentence. The sentencing hearing in Nassau County Court was emotionally devastating. Matthew's father, Ruth's husband, delivered a victim impact statement that left no doubt about his feelings. She didn't just kill our son. She destroyed our entire family. Our other children will live with this trauma forever. I will never forgive her. The judge sentenced Ruth Durienza Whitehead to 25 years to life in prison. With good behavior, she could theoretically be eligible for parole after 25 years, meaning she'd be in her 70s. But parole for child killers is extremely rare. More likely, Ruth will die in prison. You were gifted with the ability to save lives, the judge told her during sentencing. Instead, you took the most precious life of all, your own child's. There is no sentence I can impose that will bring Matthew back or heal the wounds you've inflicted on this family. Current status. Ruth Durienza Whitehead is currently incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, New York's maximum security prison for women. At 50 years old, she is among the youngest inmates serving time for murdering their own children. Reports from the prison indicate she has struggled to adapt to incarceration. Fellow inmates, even those convicted of violent crimes, view maternal filicide as particularly reprehensible. She has been placed in protective custody multiple times after threats from other prisoners. She has reportedly expressed remorse, writing letters to Matthew's siblings apologizing for what she did. Those letters have been returned unopened. Her surviving children want nothing to do with the woman who murdered their brother. The medical license she worked so hard to earn has been permanently revoked. The career she dedicated her life to is over. The family she created is destroyed. And a 13-year-old boy who should be graduating high school right now is dead. Ruth Durienza Whitehead serves as a chilling reminder that education, success, and professional achievement are no protection against the capacity for evil. Beneath her surgeon's scrubs beat the heart of a murderer. And Matthew paid the ultimate price. Case 5. Nancy Vogt. Murder for motorcycle insurance money. When greed destroys a marriage. Harleysville, Pennsylvania, is a small community in Montgomery County where neighbors know each other and trust runs deep. It's the kind of place where people leave their doors unlocked, where kids ride bikes in the street until the streetlights come on, where everyone waves to each other at the local grocery store. It's not the kind of place where you expect a wife to brutally murder her husband for insurance money. But on October 5, 2018, that's exactly what happened. The 911 call. At approximately 9:30 in the evening, Nancy Vogt called 911 from her home on Harleysville Pike. Her voice was panicked, breathless. "My husband. I think he's having a heart attack. Please send help." Paramedics arrived within minutes. They found 51-year-old David Vogt lying on the bedroom floor, unresponsive. Nancy was hovering over him, seemingly distressed and frantic. EMTs began working on David immediately, but something didn't add up. The symptoms Nancy was describing didn't quite match what they were seeing. And when they examined David more closely, they noticed something that didn't fit with a heart attack at all. Blood. Not a lot of blood. Not the kind of obvious trauma that screams violence. But blood nonetheless, in places it shouldn't be if this were a natural death. David Vogt was pronounced dead at the scene. And what started as a medical emergency response quickly became a homicide investigation. The investigation. The Montgomery County Coroner's Office conducted an autopsy on David Vogt. The results were shocking. David hadn't died from a heart attack. He had been poisoned, specifically with a massive dose of a medication he wasn't prescribed. Toxicology reports showed lethal levels of a powerful sedative in David's system. Someone had given him enough medication to stop his heart and suppress his breathing. This was murder, carefully planned to look like natural causes. Detectives turned their attention to the obvious suspect, Nancy Vogt. They obtained search warrants for the family's home, computers, and financial records. What they discovered painted a damning picture. First, the financial motive. David had recently purchased a substantial life insurance policy. Nancy was the sole beneficiary. If David died, Nancy would receive over $200,000. Second, the means. Investigators found evidence that Nancy had obtained the medication used to poison David. She had access to it through a family member who was prescribed similar medications. Third, the opportunity. Nancy was the only person with David when he died. She had prepared his dinner that evening. She had given him what she claimed were vitamins or supplements. Nobody else had access to him during the critical time period when he was poisoned. But perhaps most damning were Nancy's internet searches in the weeks before David's death. She had researched undetectable poisons. She had looked up heart attack symptoms. She had searched for how to kill someone without getting caught. The marriage. From the outside, the Vogt marriage looked stable. They'd been together for decades. They had raised children. They lived in a nice home in a safe community. But as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered the truth. The marriage was a facade held together by financial need and habit, not love. Friends reported that Nancy had been complaining about David for years. She was tired of being married to him. She felt trapped. But divorce wasn't an option. They couldn't afford to split their assets, and Nancy didn't want to lose her lifestyle. Nancy had even mentioned to a close friend that she wished David would just die. At the time, the friend had assumed it was just venting, the kind of thing frustrated spouses say without meaning it. Now, that statement took on sinister meaning. David, for his part, seemed unaware of his wife's feelings. Colleagues and friends described him as a devoted husband who loved his wife and worked hard to provide for his family. He had no idea that the woman he trusted most in the world was planning to murder him. The life insurance policy. About 6 months before his death, David had purchased a new life insurance policy worth $250,000. Nancy had encouraged him to get the policy, telling him it was important to protect their family's financial future. What David didn't know was that Nancy had been the one to research policies, find an agent, and push for the higher coverage amount. She had framed it as responsible planning. In reality, she was setting up her payday. Insurance investigators later testified that Nancy had called multiple times to confirm the policy was in force and to clarify the claims process. She wanted to make absolutely sure that when David died, she would get her money. The policy had a 2-year contestability period, meaning the insurance company could deny claims if the insured died under suspicious circumstances within 2 years of purchasing the policy. David had died 18 months into that period, close enough to the end that Nancy probably hoped the insurance company wouldn't look too closely, but still within the window where they would investigate thoroughly. That investigation, combined with the police homicide investigation, sealed Nancy's fate. The victim, David Vogt. David Vogt was 51 years old. He worked in manufacturing and had been with the same company for over 2 decades. Colleagues described him as reliable, hardworking, and friendly. He was the kind of guy who showed up early, stayed late when needed, and never complained. He loved motorcycles. Hence the insurance policy that Nancy had insisted he purchase to protect the family if anything happened to him. He spent his weekends working on bikes, riding with friends, attending motorcycle rallies. It was his escape, his passion, his joy. David had been married to Nancy for 28 years. They had children together, now adults living their own lives. He thought he was going to grow old with Nancy, retire, maybe travel, spend time with future grandchildren. Instead, the woman he trusted most in the world poisoned him for money. He died in his own home, in his own bed, killed by his wife's hand. The arrest and charges. On January 15, 2019, just over 3 months after David's death, Montgomery County detectives arrested Nancy Vogt. She was charged with first-degree murder, third-degree murder, and related offenses. District Attorney Kevin Steele held a press conference. This defendant murdered her husband of nearly 3 decades for insurance money. She poisoned him, watched him die, then called 911 and pretended to be a grieving widow. This was cold, calculated murder motivated by pure greed. Nancy maintained her innocence. Her attorney argued that there was no direct evidence she had administered the poison to David, that the internet searches could be explained away, that the life insurance policy was just good financial planning. But prosecutors had a strong circumstantial case. They showed the jury Nancy's internet searches. They demonstrated she had means, motive, and opportunity. They brought in toxicology experts who explained how the poison worked and how it had been administered. They showed that Nancy was the only person who could have poisoned David. The trial, held in 2020, was a masterclass in circumstantial evidence. Prosecutors methodically built their case, brick by brick, showing that while they might not have video footage of Nancy poisoning David, every piece of evidence pointed to her guilt. The defense tried to create reasonable doubt. They suggested maybe David had accidentally taken too much medication. Maybe someone else had poisoned him. Maybe the toxicology results were wrong. But the jury didn't buy it. After 3 days of deliberation, they returned with their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted. David's family members, who had sat through every day of the trial, broke down in tears. Nancy showed no emotion, the same cold detachment she displayed throughout the proceedings. The sentencing hearing focused on one question. Why? Why had Nancy Vogt, a woman with no history of violence, murdered her husband of nearly 3 decades? Prosecutors argued it was simple greed. She wanted the insurance money. She wanted to be free of her marriage. And she wanted both without the financial consequences of divorce. Nancy's attorney begged for leniency, pointing to her clean record, her age, her family. But the judge was unmoved. You murdered your husband, a man who trusted you completely, for money, the judge stated. You poisoned him in his own home, watched him die, and then tried to profit from his death. There is no sentence sufficient to reflect the magnitude of your betrayal, but the law allows me to ensure you will never harm anyone again. Nancy Vogt was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. Current status. Nancy Vogt is currently incarcerated at SCI Muncie, Pennsylvania's maximum security facility for women. At 57 years old, she will spend the rest of her life behind bars. The life insurance company, naturally, denied her claim. Not only did she not receive the $250,000 she murdered for, but David's estate sued her in civil court and won a judgment that effectively stripped her of any assets from the marriage. Nancy killed her husband for money and ended up with nothing except a prison cell and the knowledge that she destroyed her entire family for a payout she never received. Her children have disowned her. David's extended family has made it clear they never want to hear from her again. She is, in every meaningful sense, completely alone. The case of Nancy Vogt reminds us that murder for financial gain, while as old as humanity itself, never works out the way the killer plans. David Vogt is dead, a man who should be enjoying retirement right now. And Nancy Vogt will die in prison, having traded everything for money she never got to spend. Case 6. Danielle Bewley, the Valentine's Day murder. When love turns lethal. Valentine's Day 2021 should have been a celebration of love for Mitchell Bewley and his wife Danielle. Instead, it became the day Mitchell took his last breath, shot to death by the woman he'd married, the woman he'd trusted, the woman who decided that a life insurance payout was worth more than their marriage vows. The crime scene. Police in Washington County, Pennsylvania, responded to a 911 call in the early morning hours of February 14, 2021. The call came from Danielle Bewley, and her story was dramatic. Someone had broken into their home and shot her husband. Please help, she told the 911 operator, her voice shaking. Someone broke in. They shot Mitchell. There's blood everywhere. Please hurry. When officers arrived at the residence in South Strabane Township, they found exactly what Danielle had described. Mitchell Bewley, 31 years old, dead from a gunshot wound. The scene looked like a home invasion gone wrong. Furniture overturned, items scattered, signs of a struggle. But experienced homicide detectives knew that crime scenes can be staged. And as they began their investigation, red flags immediately started appearing. The investigation begins. Pennsylvania State Police investigators started with Danielle's story. She claimed she and Mitchell had been asleep when they heard someone breaking in. The intruder, she said, had come upstairs, confronted them, and shot Mitchell before fleeing. Danielle said she never got a good look at the person. It was a plausible story. Home invasions happen. Burglaries go wrong. People die in random acts of violence. But detectives noticed details that didn't add up. First, there were no signs of forced entry. Every window and door was intact. The break-in evidence looked staged. Items carefully placed to look disturbed rather than the chaos of an actual intrusion. Second, neighbors reported hearing no sounds of a break-in, no running footsteps, no vehicle speeding away. Just a single gunshot in the night. Third, and most damning, was the physical evidence. Gunshot residue analysis, blood spatter patterns, and the trajectory of the bullet all suggested the shot had been fired from very close range, not by an intruder across the room, but by someone standing right next to Mitchell. Detectives obtained warrants for the Bewleys' financial records and electronic devices. What they found gave them their motive: money. The life insurance motive. Mitchell Bewley had multiple life insurance policies totaling over $500,000. Danielle was the primary beneficiary on all of them. If Mitchell died, Danielle would receive a massive payout, enough to pay off their mortgage, their debts, and still have plenty left over. Investigators discovered that Danielle had been pressuring Mitchell to increase his life insurance coverage in the months before his death. She'd been the one to contact insurance agents, research policies, and push for higher death benefits. But here's what sealed the case against her. Danielle had been researching how to shoot someone and make it look like a home invasion. Her internet search history, recovered from her laptop, showed searches for how to fake a burglary, where to shoot someone to kill instantly, and life insurance homicide investigation. She had even watched videos on YouTube about how police investigate home invasion murders. She'd been planning Mitchell's death for months, carefully studying how to get away with it. The marriage behind closed doors. From the outside, the Bewleys looked happy. They'd been married for 6 years. They had a nice home in a good neighborhood. Both were employed. They seemed like a typical young couple building a life together. But people close to the couple told investigators a different story. The marriage was troubled. Danielle had been having an affair, something Mitchell apparently didn't know about. She wanted out of the marriage, but didn't want to lose the financial security it provided. Friends reported that Danielle had complained about feeling trapped in the marriage. She'd mentioned wanting a fresh start and wondering what life would be like if she was single again. But she'd never mentioned divorce, probably because divorce meant splitting assets, not receiving a huge insurance payout. Mitchell's family described him as a devoted husband who was completely blindsided by Danielle's unhappiness. He'd been making plans for their future, talking about starting a family, maybe buying a bigger house. He had no idea his wife was planning to murder him. The arrest. Less than 2 weeks after Mitchell's death, as Danielle was presumably preparing to file life insurance claims, Pennsylvania State Police arrived with an arrest warrant. The charges: first-degree murder and related offenses. Danielle maintained her innocence. Her attorney claimed police had rushed to judgment, that there was no direct evidence Danielle had pulled the trigger, that the investigation had been sloppy and incomplete. But prosecutors had a strong case. They had the staged crime scene. They had the internet searches. They had the financial motive. They had gunshot residue on Danielle's hands. And they had testimony from forensic experts that the shooting couldn't have happened the way Danielle described. The victim, Mitchell Bewley. Mitchell Bewley was 31 years old. He worked in construction and was known for his work ethic and reliability. Colleagues described him as someone you could count on, someone who showed up and got the job done. He loved the outdoors, hunting, fishing, camping. He was close with his family, especially his parents, who were devastated by his death. He'd been looking forward to becoming a father someday, to teaching his future kids all the outdoor skills his own father had taught him. Mitchell trusted Danielle completely. He'd taken out those life insurance policies because Danielle had convinced him it was the responsible thing to do. He thought he was protecting his wife's financial future if something happened to him. He never imagined she would murder him to collect that money. He died on Valentine's Day, a day that's supposed to celebrate love. Instead, it became the day his wife demonstrated that she loved money more than she loved him. The trial. The trial took place in Washington County Court in late 2021. Prosecutors presented their circumstantial but compelling case: the staged break-in, the internet searches, the life insurance policies, the forensic evidence showing the shot was fired at close range. The defense argued that none of this proved Danielle pulled the trigger. They suggested an unknown intruder could have shot Mitchell. They claimed the internet searches were taken out of context. They attacked the forensic evidence as inconclusive. But the jury wasn't convinced. After 2 days of deliberation, they returned with their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Danielle showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Her family members in the courtroom broke down crying, not because they believed she was innocent, but because they couldn't believe she had done something so monstrous. The sentencing hearing was emotionally charged. Mitchell's parents delivered victim impact statements that left everyone in tears. "She stole our son from us," Mitchell's mother said, her voice breaking. "She murdered him in cold blood for money. And she did it on Valentine's Day, a day that will be forever ruined for our family. We'll never hold our grandchildren that Mitchell would have given us. We'll never see him grow old. She took everything from us." The judge sentenced Danielle Bewley to life in prison without possibility of parole. Pennsylvania law mandates this sentence for first-degree murder convictions. "You planned this murder methodically," the judge told Danielle. "You researched how to do it. You staged a crime scene. You looked your husband in the eye and pulled the trigger. And you did it for money. The law allows me only one sentence, and I impose it without hesitation. Life without parole." Current status. Danielle Bewley is currently incarcerated at SCI Muncie, Pennsylvania's maximum security women's prison. At 33 years old, she will spend the next 50 or 60 years behind bars before dying in prison. The life insurance companies, naturally, denied all her claims. Not only did she not receive the money she murdered for, but Mitchell's estate sued her in civil court and was awarded the life insurance money, which went to Mitchell's parents. Danielle killed her husband for $500,000 and ended up with nothing but a life sentence. She has filed appeals, all of which have been denied. The evidence against her was overwhelming. The trial was conducted properly, and Pennsylvania courts have no interest in giving her another chance. Her affair partner, the man she was seeing while married to Mitchell, has moved on with his life and refuses to have any contact with her. Even he wants nothing to do with a woman capable of cold-blooded murder. The case of Danielle Bewley serves as a stark reminder that life insurance, intended to protect families, can become a motive for murder. Mitchell Bewley bought those policies to take care of his wife if something happened to him. Instead, she made something happen to him so she could collect the money. Case 7. Marie Scott, the longest-serving woman in Pennsylvania prisons. 5 decades behind bars for felony murder. On a fall evening in 1973, a robbery went terribly wrong in Philadelphia. When the smoke cleared, one man was dead, and Marie Scott, just 19 years old at the time, would begin a sentence that has now lasted over 5 decades, making her one of the longest-serving female inmates in Pennsylvania history. The crime, October 1973. The robbery itself was almost mundane in its simplicity. Marie Scott and several accomplices decided to rob a small grocery store in North Philadelphia. It was supposed to be quick, easy money. No one was supposed to get hurt. But robberies rarely go according to plan. The store owner, 53-year-old James Wilson, a Korean War veteran who had run his corner store for over 15 years, wasn't about to let criminals steal what he'd worked so hard to build. He resisted, and in the chaos that followed, shots were fired. James Wilson was shot multiple times. He died at the scene, bleeding out on the floor of his own store, while his wife watched in horror from behind the counter. Marie Scott and her accomplices fled with less than $300 in cash. The felony murder rule. Here's where Marie Scott's case becomes legally significant. She didn't pull the trigger. One of her male accomplices did the actual shooting. But under Pennsylvania's felony murder rule, a law that remains controversial to this day, anyone who participates in a felony during which someone dies can be charged with murder, regardless of who actually killed the victim. The rationale is straightforward. If you choose to commit a dangerous felony like armed robbery, you bear responsibility for any deaths that result, even if you didn't personally fire the weapon. The law treats all participants as equally culpable for the foreseeable consequences of their criminal actions. For Marie Scott, this meant a first-degree murder charge even though prosecutors acknowledged she hadn't shot James Wilson. She had been there. She had participated in the robbery. She had been part of the criminal enterprise that led to a man's death. Under Pennsylvania law, that was enough. The investigation and arrest. The investigation moved quickly. Multiple witnesses had seen the robbers flee the scene. Security cameras, primitive by today's standards, but functional, had captured images of the perpetrators. Within 48 hours, Philadelphia police had identified and arrested Marie Scott and her 3 accomplices. During interrogation, Marie initially tried to minimize her role. She claimed she hadn't known the others were armed. She said she thought it was just going to be a simple theft, not a violent robbery. She insisted she never intended for anyone to get hurt. But prosecutors weren't interested in her intentions. They were interested in her actions. She had participated in an armed robbery. A man had died. Under Pennsylvania law, that made her a murderer. The trial. Marie Scott's trial took place in Philadelphia County Court in 1974. It was a relatively brief proceeding by today's standards. The evidence was straightforward. Witnesses placed her at the scene. She'd admitted participating in the robbery, and James Wilson was dead as a direct result of that robbery. Her defense attorney argued that Marie was just a teenager, that she'd been influenced by older, more experienced criminals, that she deserved leniency because she hadn't fired the fatal shots. The attorney begged the jury to consider Marie's youth and lack of prior criminal record. But prosecutors emphasized that James Wilson was dead, that his wife was now a widow, that his children no longer had a father, all because Marie Scott and her friends decided to rob a store. They argued that the felony murder rule exists precisely for cases like this, where criminal enterprises result in death. The jury deliberated for less than a day before returning with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing: life without parole. In 1974, Judge Thomas Reed sentenced Marie Scott to life in prison without possibility of parole. At just 19 years old, she had effectively received a death sentence. Except instead of execution, she would spend the next 50-plus years behind bars. The judge was unmoved by pleas for leniency. "A good man is dead," he stated during sentencing. "A family has been destroyed. This defendant may not have fired the weapon, but she was an essential participant in the crime that led to James Wilson's death. The law holds her fully accountable." Marie Scott was transferred to the State Correctional Institution at Muncie, Pennsylvania's prison for women serving long sentences. She was 19 years old. The year was 1974. Richard Nixon had just resigned. Gas cost 53 cents a gallon. The Vietnam War was winding down. Marie Scott would remain in prison as the decades rolled by. Through the 1980s. Through the 1990s. Through Y2K and September 11th and the Great Recession and the COVID pandemic. Through 13 different governors and 10 different presidents. Life in prison, 5 decades. Marie Scott is now 70 years old. She has spent over 50 years, more than 2/3 of her entire life, in prison. She has been incarcerated longer than many of her fellow inmates have been alive. During her decades behind bars, Marie has maintained a spotless disciplinary record. She's participated in every rehabilitation program available. She's earned her GED, taken college courses, worked in various prison jobs. She's become a mentor to younger inmates, warning them about the consequences of criminal choices. Prison staff describe her as a model inmate, cooperative, respectful, never causing problems. She's the kind of prisoner correctional officers wish all inmates could be. But here's the harsh reality of life without parole: none of that matters. Good behavior, rehabilitation, genuine remorse. None of it changes her sentence. She will die in prison. Not because she's dangerous. Not because she poses a threat to society. But because Pennsylvania law says that anyone convicted of first-degree murder receives life without parole. The controversy: has justice been served? Marie Scott's case has become a rallying point for criminal justice reform advocates who argue that the felony murder rule is unjust and that life without parole should be reserved for the most heinous offenders. Reform advocates point out that Marie was 19 at the time of the crime, barely an adult. She didn't fire the weapon. She spent over 50 years in prison with perfect behavior. She poses zero risk to public safety. Keeping her incarcerated at this point serves no purpose other than punishment for punishment's sake. The shooter in Marie's case, the person who actually pulled the trigger and killed James Wilson, died in prison decades ago after serving 31 years. Marie has now been in prison nearly twice as long as the actual killer. Victims' rights advocates counter that James Wilson is still dead, that his family still grieves, that Marie Scott made a choice to participate in a violent crime. They argue that life sentences mean life, that there should be no parole for murderers, regardless of who pulled the trigger. It's a debate that cuts to the heart of fundamental questions about criminal justice. What is prison for? Punishment? Rehabilitation? Public safety? All three. At what point, if ever, has someone paid their debt to society? Failed commutation attempts. Over the years, Marie Scott has applied for commutation of her sentence multiple times. Every Pennsylvania governor since 1974 has denied her requests. The reasons vary. Some governors cite the severity of the original crime. Others point to political pressure from victims' rights groups. Some simply note that under Pennsylvania law, life without parole means exactly that, life without parole. In 2022, Governor Tom Wolf considered granting clemency to several long-serving inmates, including Marie Scott. Advocates presented evidence of her perfect prison record, her age and declining health, the excessive length of her sentence compared to similar cases. But ultimately, Wolf declined to grant her clemency. James Wilson's surviving family members had written letters opposing her release, stating that their father was still dead and that his killer should remain in prison. The political calculus made clemency too risky. The victim, James Wilson. In discussions about criminal justice reform and excessive sentences, it's easy to forget the human being whose death started this entire chain of events. James Wilson was 53 years old when he died. He'd served in the Korean War. He'd built a successful small business in a challenging neighborhood. He provided for his family through hard work and determination. He didn't deserve to die bleeding on his store floor because some teenagers wanted quick cash. His wife didn't deserve to be widowed. His children didn't deserve to lose their father. No sentence can bring James Wilson back. No amount of punishment can undo the harm that Marie Scott and her accomplices caused. That's the fundamental tragedy at the heart of this case. Current status. Marie Scott remains incarcerated at SCI Muncie, now in the geriatric unit due to her age and declining health. She requires regular medical care for conditions associated with aging. The state spends significantly more to incarcerate elderly inmates than younger ones. Marie's imprisonment costs Pennsylvania taxpayers over $60,000 per year. She has accepted that she will die in prison. She's made peace with it as much as anyone can. She spends her days in quiet routine, meals, limited recreation, occasional visits from a few remaining family members and supporters. The world she knew when she entered prison in 1974 no longer exists. The Philadelphia she returns to in her memories, the city of her youth, has been transformed beyond recognition. Technology, culture, society itself have all changed in ways she can barely comprehend. Marie Scott is a living relic of a different era of American criminal justice, a time when mandatory life sentences were imposed with little consideration for individual circumstances, rehabilitation potential, or proportionality of punishment. Whether you view her as a cautionary tale about the consequences of criminal choices or as an example of excessive sentencing, one thing is certain: Marie Scott will never leave prison alive. After 51 years behind bars, she will die incarcerated for a crime she committed as a teenager over half a century ago. Case 8. Gail Stallworth. Murder for 8 cents. The most senseless killing in Pennsylvania history. Some murders are committed for passion, some for revenge, some for substantial financial gain. And then there's the case of Gail Stallworth, a woman who participated in a robbery murder for a share of 8 cents. 8 cents. Less than the cost of a piece of candy. And because of it, she's been in prison for over 40 years. The crime, summer 1979. On a humid evening in July 1979 in Erie, Pennsylvania, a simple robbery turned deadly. Gail Stallworth, along with several accomplices, targeted an elderly man they believed had money in his home. The victim, 74-year-old Andrew Kuzma, lived alone in a modest house in a working-class neighborhood. The robbery was poorly planned and brutally executed. The group broke into Kuzma's home around 9 in the evening. They ransacked the house looking for cash, jewelry, anything valuable. When Andrew Kuzma tried to resist or call for help, one of the robbers beat him savagely. The elderly man died from blunt force trauma to his head. And what did they get for their trouble? What was the monetary value of Andrew Kuzma's life? The robbers found a total of 32 cents in loose change scattered around the house. 32 cents. Divided among 4 participants. 8 cents each. Gail Stallworth's share of the robbery that resulted in murder, 8 cents. The investigation. Erie police caught a break in the case almost immediately. Neighbors had seen suspicious individuals near Kuzma's house around the time of the murder. One had even jotted down a partial license plate number. Within 48 hours, police had identified and arrested all 4 participants. Gail Stallworth, then 23 years old, and 3 male accomplices ranging in age from 19 to 27. During interrogation, the accomplices quickly turned on each other, each trying to minimize their own role while implicating the others. Gail claimed she'd just been a lookout, that she hadn't known violence was planned, that she'd had no idea anyone would get hurt. But Pennsylvania's felony murder rule, the same legal principle that sentenced Marie Scott, meant Gail's role as lookout was legally equivalent to beating Andrew Kuzma to death herself. She had participated in a felony during which someone died. Under the law, that made her a murderer. The victim, Andrew Kuzma. Andrew Kuzma was 74 years old. He'd immigrated to America from Poland as a young man, worked in Erie's manufacturing plants for over 40 years, and lived a simple, quiet life. He was a widower who kept to himself, tended a small vegetable garden, and occasionally played cards with other elderly men in the neighborhood. He wasn't wealthy. The 32 cents the robbers found was probably all the cash he had in the house. He lived on a small pension and Social Security, depositing his checks directly at the bank. There was nothing to steal. If the robbers had done even basic surveillance, they'd have realized Andrew Kuzma was the wrong target for a lucrative robbery. Instead, they broke into his home, terrorized an elderly man, beat him to death, and came away with pocket change. It was senseless violence for essentially no gain whatsoever. Andrew had no children. His wife had died several years earlier. His remaining family members, nieces and nephews who lived out of state, learned of his death through a police phone call. He died alone, beaten by strangers, for absolutely nothing. The trial and sentencing. The trial took place in Erie County Court in 1980. The evidence against all 4 defendants was overwhelming. Physical evidence placed them at the scene. Their own statements implicated each other. There was no reasonable doubt about their guilt. Gail Stallworth's attorney argued that she'd been a minor participant, that she hadn't entered the house, that she certainly hadn't struck any blows against Andrew Kuzma. But prosecutors countered that she'd been an essential part of the criminal enterprise. Without a lookout, the others wouldn't have attempted the robbery. She was as culpable as any of them. The jury took less than 3 hours to convict all 4 defendants of first-degree murder under the felony murder rule. During sentencing, the judge addressed each defendant individually. When he got to Gail Stallworth, his words were harsh. "You participated in a crime that resulted in an elderly man being beaten to death in his own home. You did this for 8 cents. 8 cents. I struggle to comprehend the moral bankruptcy that allows a person to participate in such senseless violence for such a trivial gain. You will spend the rest of your life in prison." Gail Stallworth received life without possibility of parole. She was 23 years old, 4 decades behind bars. Gail Stallworth is now 67 years old. She has been incarcerated for 45 years, nearly twice as long as she'd been alive when she committed her crime. Like Marie Scott, she has spent the majority of her life in prison. Her institutional record is mixed. Unlike Marie Scott, Gail has had multiple disciplinary infractions over the decades. Nothing extremely serious, but enough to show she struggled to adapt to prison life. She's had conflicts with other inmates, periods of depression, difficulties following institutional rules. But advocates who followed her case point out that she was essentially a kid when she went to prison. She never had a chance to develop into a mature adult in free society. Her entire adult development happened behind bars, in an environment that's not conducive to healthy psychological growth. The debate over felony murder. Cases like Gail Stallworth's and Marie Scott's have fueled ongoing debate about the felony murder rule. Critics argue that it's unjust to treat someone who was a lookout or getaway driver the same as someone who actually commits a killing. They point out that the rule can result in grossly disproportionate punishments. Supporters of the rule argue that anyone who participates in a dangerous felony bears moral and legal responsibility for all foreseeable consequences, including death. They contend that eliminating or weakening the felony murder rule would make it harder to prosecute accomplices and would fail to hold them accountable for their role in crimes that result in deaths. In Gail's case, The amount stolen, 8 cents, makes the disproportion particularly stark. A life sentence for participating in a robbery that netted 8 cents seems, to many observers, excessive to the point of absurdity. But Andrew Kuzma's life wasn't worth 8 cents. It wasn't worth $8 million. Human life is priceless. And Gail Stallworth chose to participate in a crime that cost a man his life. Failed clemency efforts. Like Marie Scott, Gail Stallworth has applied for commutation multiple times over the decades. And like Marie Scott, every Pennsylvania governor has denied her requests. The political reality is that governors face immense pressure from victims' rights groups not to grant clemency to anyone serving time for murder. Even in cases where the inmate is elderly, has served decades, poses no danger to society, the political risk of releasing someone convicted of murder is too great. Gail's most recent clemency application, filed in 2021, emphasized her age, her decades of incarceration, and the minimal role she played in Andrew Kuzma's death. It was denied without comment. Current status. Gail Stallworth remains incarcerated at SCI Muncie. She has significant health problems, diabetes, high blood pressure, arthritis, common conditions among elderly long-term prisoners. She requires regular medical care that costs Pennsylvania taxpayers substantially more than incarcerating a younger, healthier inmate. She has few visitors. Most of her family members have died or moved on with their lives. Her parents died while she was in prison. Siblings and cousins have stopped maintaining contact. She will die in prison, probably within the next 10 to 15 years given her health conditions. She'll have spent approximately 5 decades behind bars for participating in a robbery that netted 8 cents and resulted in an elderly man's death. The unanswered question. Here's the question that haunts Gail Stallworth's case. Has justice been served? Is the world safer because a woman who participated in a robbery as a 23-year-old has been locked up for 45 years? There's no easy answer. Andrew Kuzma is still dead. His death was senseless and tragic. Someone had to be held accountable. But accountability and proportionality aren't the same thing. A life sentence for being a lookout in a robbery that netted 8 cents strikes many observers as fundamentally disproportionate, regardless of how tragic Andrew Kuzma's death was. Gail Stallworth's case is a stark reminder that under Pennsylvania law, life without parole means exactly that, life without parole, regardless of the defendant's age at the time of the crime, the specific role they played, or how long they've been incarcerated. For 8 cents, Gail Stallworth forfeited the rest of her life. Whether you view that as justice served or justice perverted probably depends on your broader views about crime, punishment, and the purpose of the criminal justice system. Case 9. Kimberly Stahl, the methamphetamine murder of a mother. When drug addiction leads to unthinkable violence. Cumberland County, Pennsylvania, a quiet region of rolling farmland and small towns, isn't typically associated with violent crime. But on March 17, 2017, a drug-fueled attack would shock the community and result in one of the most disturbing murder cases in the county's history. The crime. The 911 call came in at 2:30 in the afternoon. A frantic woman reported that someone had been attacked at a residence in Silver Spring Township, just outside Harrisburg. The caller's voice was erratic, her words jumbled. She was clearly under the influence of something, but the dispatcher could make out enough to send police and paramedics immediately. When first responders arrived at the modest home on Sporting Hill Road, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. 56-year-old Rita Stahl lay on the living room floor, barely conscious, having suffered massive blunt force trauma to her head. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, the furniture, the floor. This wasn't just an attack. This was sustained, brutal violence. Rita was rushed to Hershey Medical Center with catastrophic injuries. Doctors fought to save her, but the damage was too severe. She died 2 days later, on March 19th, without regaining consciousness. And the person who had inflicted those injuries? Her own daughter, Kimberly Stahl. The methamphetamine connection. As investigators began piecing together what happened, a clear picture emerged. Kimberly Stahl, 31 years old, had been using methamphetamine. Not casually. Not recreationally. She was in the throes of a full-blown meth addiction that had destroyed her judgment, her empathy, and ultimately her humanity. On the day of the attack, Kimberly had been awake for multiple days straight, using meth continuously. She was experiencing methamphetamine-induced psychosis, a condition where users become paranoid, delusional, and sometimes violently aggressive. Kimberly had become convinced that her mother was part of some conspiracy against her. She believed Rita was stealing from her, talking about her behind her back, plotting to have her committed. None of it was real. It was all meth-induced paranoia. But in Kimberly's distorted reality, her mother had become the enemy. The attack itself was sustained and brutal. Kimberly used multiple objects to beat her mother: a lamp, a piece of furniture, her own fists and feet. Rita Stahl, a small, elderly woman, had no chance of defending herself against her drug-crazed daughter. The investigation. Cumberland County detectives found Kimberly at the scene, covered in her mother's blood, still in the grip of methamphetamine psychosis. She was ranting about conspiracies, about people trying to hurt her, about having to defend herself. She was arrested immediately and taken to the hospital for medical clearance before being transported to county jail. As the meth cleared from her system over the following days, the enormity of what she'd done began to sink in. Investigators executed search warrants and found extensive evidence of methamphetamine use throughout the home: pipes, residue, the telltale signs of chronic meth addiction. They interviewed neighbors who reported that Kimberly had been acting increasingly erratic in the weeks before the murder, displaying classic signs of meth-induced paranoia. Phone records showed Kimberly had been sending dozens of incoherent text messages to various people, rambling about persecution and threats that didn't exist. Friends she'd contacted described her as completely out of it and not making any sense. The victim, Rita Stahl. Rita Stahl was 56 years old. She'd worked as a nurse for over 3 decades, dedicating her life to caring for others. Colleagues described her as compassionate, skilled, and deeply committed to her patients. Rita had been trying to help her daughter overcome addiction. She'd paid for rehab programs. She'd attended support groups for families of addicts. She'd let Kimberly live with her, hoping a stable environment would help her daughter get clean. Instead, Rita's compassion and love for her daughter cost her her life. She died trying to help the person she'd given birth to, the child she'd raised, the daughter she loved unconditionally. Rita had other family members, a son who lived out of state, siblings, nieces, and nephews. Her funeral was packed with colleagues from the hospital, neighbors, friends. Everyone who knew her described her the same way: kind, caring, always willing to help others. Her death was senseless, tragic, and completely preventable. If Kimberly had gotten help for her addiction earlier, if she'd stayed in rehab, if she'd avoided methamphetamine, Rita Stahl would still be alive. The charges. Kimberly Stahl was charged with first-degree murder, third-degree murder, and aggravated assault. The first-degree murder charge was based on Pennsylvania's felony murder rule. Kimberly had been committing the felony of aggravated assault when Rita died, making it first-degree murder even though there may not have been premeditation in the traditional sense. Her defense attorney faced an impossible challenge. There was no question Kimberly had killed her mother. The evidence was overwhelming. The only potential defense was diminished capacity due to methamphetamine-induced psychosis. The defense argued that Kimberly had been so impaired by drugs that she couldn't form the specific intent required for first-degree murder. She didn't know what she was doing. She was in the grip of drug-induced delusions. She wasn't in control of her actions. But prosecutors countered that voluntary drug use doesn't absolve someone of responsibility for their actions. Kimberly had made the choice to use methamphetamine. She knew the drug was dangerous. The fact that she was high when she killed her mother didn't make her less guilty. It made the crime even more senseless. The trial. The trial took place in Cumberland County Court in late 2017. It was emotionally devastating for everyone involved. The prosecution presented graphic photos of the crime scene and Rita's injuries. They called medical experts who testified about the sustained, brutal nature of the attack. They showed the jury the weapons Kimberly had used to beat her mother to death. The defense called addiction specialists who explained how methamphetamine affects the brain, how it can cause psychosis, how users can lose touch with reality. They presented evidence of Kimberly's long struggle with addiction, her multiple attempts at rehab, her deteriorating mental state. But ultimately, the jury faced a simple question: did voluntary drug use excuse murder? After 3 days of deliberation, they answered with a resounding no. Kimberly Stahl was found guilty of third-degree murder. The jury declined to convict on first degree, apparently accepting that the meth psychosis prevented full premeditation, but they held her accountable for her mother's death. The sentencing. The sentencing hearing was heartbreaking. Rita's family members delivered victim impact statements that detailed the devastating loss of a beloved sister, aunt, and friend. Rita's son spoke about losing his mother to his sister's addiction. "My mother spent her entire life helping people," he said through tears. "She was a nurse. She saved lives. And she died trying to save my sister from her addiction. That's the ultimate tragedy. Mom died doing what she always did, trying to help someone she loved." The judge sentenced Kimberly Stahl to 25 to 50 years in prison. With good behavior, she could theoretically be eligible for parole after serving 25 years. She'd be in her mid-50s if she lives that long. "You killed your own mother while in a drug-induced state that you voluntarily entered," the judge stated. "Your mother tried to save you from your addiction. Instead, your addiction killed her. You'll have decades to contemplate the consequences of your choices." The methamphetamine epidemic. Kimberly Stahl's case is emblematic of a larger crisis, the methamphetamine epidemic ravaging rural and suburban America. Meth isn't a big city drug. It's devastated small towns and suburban communities across Pennsylvania and the entire United States. Methamphetamine is particularly dangerous because of its psychological effects. Unlike opioids, which primarily cause respiratory depression and overdose, meth causes aggression, paranoia, and psychosis. Users become violent. They harm themselves and others. Kimberly Stahl is not unique. Across America, there are dozens of cases each year where methamphetamine users kill family members during drug-induced psychotic episodes. Parents kill children. Children kill parents. Spouses kill each other, all while high on a drug that fundamentally breaks their connection to reality and humanity. Current status. Kimberly Stahl is currently incarcerated at SCI Muncie. She's 37 years old now, having spent 7 years in prison. She has at least 18 more years before she's even eligible for parole consideration. Reports from the prison indicate she's sober now, obviously, given the controlled environment, and has expressed profound remorse for what she did. She's participated in substance abuse treatment programs and has become a mentor to other inmates struggling with addiction. But remorse doesn't bring Rita Stahl back. Being clean now doesn't erase the fact that she beat her mother to death while high on meth. She will live with that knowledge for the rest of her life. She's written letters to her brother and other family members apologizing for what she did. Most of those letters have gone unanswered or been returned unopened. The family wants nothing to do with her. In killing their mother, she also killed her relationship with the rest of her family. Kimberly's story is a cautionary tale about the devastating consequences of methamphetamine addiction. She wasn't a career criminal. She didn't have a history of violence. Before drugs, she was, by all accounts, a normal person. But methamphetamine changed her. It destroyed her judgment, her empathy, her humanity. And in a drug-fueled psychotic episode, she murdered the one person who had never given up on her, her own mother. Case 10. Amber Rivera, the newborn murder in the bathroom. When postpartum psychosis turns deadly. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania's Amish country, where horse-drawn buggies share roads with modern cars and pastoral farmland stretches to the horizon, seems an unlikely setting for a case that would challenge fundamental assumptions about maternal instinct, mental illness, and criminal responsibility. On December 4, 2019, inside a modest apartment in the city of Lancaster, a tragedy unfolded that would shock the community and raise disturbing questions about how we treat mental illness in the criminal justice system. The 911 call. At approximately 3 in the morning, a frantic call came into Lancaster County 911 dispatch. The caller was 24-year-old Amber Rivera, and her words were almost incomprehensible through her hysterical sobbing. "My baby. I think she's dead. I don't know what happened. Please help." Paramedics and police raced to the apartment complex on New Holland Avenue. When they arrived, they found Amber Rivera in a state of complete psychological breakdown, rocking back and forth, covered in blood, repeating, I'm sorry," over and over. In the bathroom, officers made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their careers: a newborn baby girl, deceased, showing signs of trauma consistent with being harmed shortly after birth. The devastating truth. As investigators pieced together what happened, a horrifying picture emerged. Amber Rivera had concealed her pregnancy from everyone: family, friends, her boyfriend. She'd experienced what medical professionals call pregnancy denial, where a woman psychologically blocks out the reality of being pregnant. On the night of December 3rd, Amber had gone into labor alone in her bathroom. She'd given birth by herself. No medical care, no support, nothing. And then, in the grips of what forensic psychiatrists would later identify as acute postpartum psychosis, she had harmed her newborn daughter. The baby, later named Baby Doe Rivera, in court documents since Amber had never named her, had lived for approximately 30 minutes after birth before dying from injuries inflicted by her mother. The mental health crisis. What makes Amber Rivera's case different from most of the others in this documentary is the overwhelming evidence of severe mental illness. Multiple forensic psychiatrists who examined her agreed. Amber had experienced acute postpartum psychosis, a rare but extremely dangerous condition that can cause women to harm themselves or their newborns. Postpartum psychosis affects approximately 1 to 2 out of every 1,000 women who give birth. It typically manifests within hours or days of delivery and can cause severe confusion and disorientation, hallucinations and delusions, paranoia and irrational fears, loss of inhibitions, extreme mood swings, complete break from reality. Women experiencing postpartum psychosis often don't understand what they're doing. They may hear voices telling them to harm their baby. They may believe the baby is possessed or evil. They may think they're protecting the child by killing it. Their actions, while horrific, occur while they're in a state of complete psychotic break from reality. Amber Rivera displayed classic symptoms. In the hours after giving birth, she experienced vivid hallucinations. She believed the baby was somehow wrong or not real. She couldn't distinguish reality from delusion. And in that state, she did something she would never have done while sane. The investigation. Lancaster County detectives faced a complex case. On one hand, a newborn was dead at her mother's hands, clear-cut homicide. On the other hand, the perpetrator was clearly mentally ill, possibly to the point of legal insanity. They obtained Amber's medical records and discovered she'd been struggling with mental health issues for years: depression, anxiety, possible bipolar disorder. She'd been on and off various medications. She'd had multiple psychiatric hospitalizations in her late teens and early 20s. Amber had also been a victim of domestic violence. Her boyfriend, who was the father of the baby, had been physically abusive. She'd been isolated from her family and had no support system. The pregnancy itself had apparently been unwanted and terrifying for Amber. Rather than seek help, she'd gone into complete psychological denial. She hadn't sought prenatal care. She'd hidden the pregnancy from everyone. And when labor began, she'd been alone and completely unprepared for what was happening to her body and mind. The charges and the insanity defense. Amber Rivera was charged with first-degree murder and related offenses. But her defense attorney immediately signaled they would pursue an insanity defense, arguing that Amber had been so mentally ill at the time of the killing that she couldn't understand the nature of her actions or distinguish right from wrong. Pennsylvania uses the Manhattan rule for insanity defenses, which requires proving that at the time of the crime, the defendant either didn't know what they were doing or didn't know what they were doing was wrong. It's a very high bar. Most insanity defenses fail. But in Amber's case, the psychiatric evidence was compelling. 3 separate forensic psychiatrists examined Amber. All 3 agreed. She had been experiencing acute postpartum psychosis at the time of the baby's death. All 3 believed she genuinely didn't understand what she was doing or that it was wrong. The trial. The trial took place in Lancaster County Court in late 2020. It was unlike most murder trials in that the defense openly admitted Amber had killed her baby. The entire case hinged on her mental state at the time. Prosecutors presented the physical evidence: the baby's injuries, the timeline of events, Amber's actions immediately after the birth. They argued that while Amber may have been depressed or stressed, she knew what she was doing and chose to kill her child. The defense presented extensive psychiatric testimony about postpartum psychosis. They brought in experts on maternal mental health who explained how this condition can cause women to act in ways completely foreign to their normal character. They presented evidence of Amber's long history of mental illness, her lack of prenatal care, her psychological pregnancy denial. Perhaps most powerfully, They showed the jury recordings of Amber's psychiatric evaluations, where she clearly had no understanding of why she'd done what she'd done. "I would never hurt a baby," she said in one recording, seemingly unaware that she had, in fact, killed her own newborn. "I love babies. Why would anyone do something like that?" This dissociation, her inability to connect her actions with herself, was powerful evidence of psychosis. The verdict, after 4 days of deliberation, an unusually long time, suggesting the jury struggled with the decision, they returned with their verdict, not guilty by reason of insanity. It was a controversial decision. Some community members were outraged, believing Amber had gotten away with murder. Letters to the editor in local newspapers expressed anger that a woman who killed her newborn wouldn't spend life in prison. But the jury had followed the law. The evidence of psychosis had been overwhelming. Amber Rivera had been legally insane at the time she killed her baby. However, not guilty by reason of insanity doesn't mean free to go. It means indefinite civil commitment to a psychiatric facility until such time as the defendant is no longer a danger to herself or others. The sentence, indefinite psychiatric commitment. The judge ordered Amber Rivera committed to Norristown State Hospital, Pennsylvania's maximum security psychiatric facility for criminal defendants found not guilty by reason of insanity. She would remain there indefinitely, potentially for the rest of her life. Every year, a review board evaluates her mental health and determines whether she's safe to be released. So far, she's been denied release every year. She will likely remain institutionalized for decades, receiving treatment for her mental illness, but also being held accountable for what she did. This is not a happy ending, the judge stated during the commitment hearing. A baby is dead. That baby's death was caused by her mother's actions. But those actions were the product of severe mental illness, not criminal intent. Ms. Rivera will receive the treatment she needs, but she will remain under state custody for the foreseeable future. The controversy, justice or injustice? Amber Rivera's case raises profound questions about criminal responsibility and mental illness. On one side, a baby is dead. The person who killed her is in a psychiatric hospital instead of prison. Is that justice for the baby? Don't all murderers deserve prison, regardless of their mental state? On the other side, punishing someone for actions they took while psychotic accomplishes nothing. Amber Rivera didn't choose to develop postpartum psychosis. She was desperately ill. Sending her to prison instead of a hospital would be cruel and unjust. Mental health advocates point to Amber's case as evidence that the criminal justice system needs better mechanisms for dealing with maternal mental illness. If Amber had received proper prenatal care, if someone had recognized her pregnancy denial and psychological distress, if she'd been evaluated by a mental health professional before giving birth, this tragedy might have been prevented. Victims' rights advocates counter that while mental illness is real and tragic, it can't excuse all behavior. A baby died. Someone has to be held accountable. Current status. Amber Rivera remains at Norristown State Hospital, now in her 5th year of commitment. Reports indicate she's responded well to treatment. She's on medications that have stabilized her mental health. She no longer experiences psychotic symptoms. She has expressed profound remorse for what she did, though psychiatrists note it's complicated because she genuinely has no clear memory of the killing itself, only being told about it afterward. It's as if she's mourning a crime someone else committed, even though she knows intellectually that she did it. She participates in therapy focused on processing her trauma, managing her mental illness, and developing coping mechanisms. She'll never be able to have other children, not because she's legally prevented, but because the psychological trauma of what happened has made the idea impossible for her. Annual review boards continue to deny her release. Even though she's mentally stable now, the nature of her commitment, killing a newborn during a psychotic episode, means she'll likely remain institutionalized for many more years, possibly decades. Some family members have maintained contact with her, visiting her at the hospital. Others have cut off all communication, unable to reconcile their love for Amber with the horror of what she did. Amber Rivera will spend much of her life institutionalized for killing her own newborn baby during a psychotic break. Whether you view this as appropriate treatment for mental illness or inadequate justice for a murdered child probably depends on your broader views about mental illness, criminal responsibility, and the purpose of the justice system. Conclusion: the women behind bars forever. 10 women, 10 life sentences, 10 stories of choices, crimes, and consequences that will keep them behind bars until death. Heather Presti, the nurse serial killer who murdered 17 elderly patients. Lisa Snyder, who strangled her 2 children and tried to make it look like suicide. Trin Gwynn, who killed her sons and set her house on fire. Ruth Dirienza Whitehead, the surgeon who stabbed her teenage son to death. Nancy Vogt, who poisoned her husband for life insurance money. Danielle Bewley, who shot her husband on Valentine's Day for financial gain. Marie Scott, serving over 5 decades for a felony murder during a robbery in 1973. Gail Stallworth, imprisoned for 45 years for a robbery murder that netted 8 cents. Kimberly Stahl, who beat her mother to death while high on methamphetamine. Amber Rivera, confined indefinitely to a psychiatric hospital for killing her newborn during postpartum psychosis. Each case is unique. Each tells a different story about what leads human beings to cross the ultimate line, taking another person's life. Some killed for money. Some killed their own children. Some killed in drug-fueled rages. One killed because of severe mental illness. But they all share one thing in common. They will never leave prison alive. Whether in maximum security correctional facilities or secure psychiatric hospitals, these women will spend the rest of their lives behind bars, their freedom permanently revoked by the crimes they committed. The broader questions. These cases force us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, punishment, and rehabilitation. Is life without parole always justified? Or are there cases where even murderers might deserve a second chance after decades of incarceration? How should the criminal justice system handle cases involving severe mental illness, like postpartum psychosis? Does the felony murder rule make sense when applied to lookouts and getaway drivers who didn't personally kill anyone? At what point, if ever, has someone served enough time for their crime? Should age at the time of the crime, being 19 or 23, factor into sentencing? There are no easy answers. The victims in these cases, from nursing home patients to young children to elderly robbery victims, had their lives stolen. No amount of punishment can bring them back. Their families live with permanent grief. But we must also grapple with what it means for society to lock people away forever. Some of these women are genuinely dangerous and need to remain incarcerated for public safety. Others, like Marie Scott, now 70 and incarcerated for 51 years, pose zero threat to anyone but remain in prison because Pennsylvania law mandates life without parole for first-degree murder. The cost of forever. Keeping someone in prison for life is expensive. The average cost of incarcerating an elderly inmate in Pennsylvania exceeds $60,000 per year. Multiply that by decades, and each lifer costs taxpayers well over $1 million. But cost isn't the primary consideration. Justice, public safety, and accountability matter more than money. The question isn't whether we can afford to keep them locked up. It's whether justice demands it. The takeaway. If there's one lesson from these 10 cases, it's this. Murder has consequences that extend far beyond the moment the crime is committed. These women made choices, sometimes in seconds, sometimes over months of planning, that destroyed not just their victims' lives, but their own. Heather Presti will never care for another patient. Lisa Snyder will never hold another child. Trin Gwynn will never see her sons grow up, because she killed them. Ruth Dirienza Whitehead will never perform another surgery. Nancy Vogt will never see a penny of the insurance money she killed for. Danielle Bewley will never celebrate another Valentine's Day in freedom. Marie Scott will die in the same prison she entered in 1974. Gail Stallworth will never spend the 8 cents she murdered for. Kimberly Stahl will never share another moment with the mother she killed. Amber Rivera will never overcome the trauma of what she did during her psychotic break. They chose to kill. Now they will pay with the rest of their lives. Final message. Thank you for watching this deep dive into Pennsylvania's women serving life sentences. If you found this investigation valuable, please hit the like button, leave a comment with your thoughts on these cases, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour for more in-depth true crime documentaries. These stories are difficult, disturbing, and tragic, but they're important. They remind us of the preciousness of life, the finality of murder, and the consequences that follow when human beings choose violence over compassion. The victims in these cases deserved better. The families left behind deserve to be remembered. And the women behind bars serve as cautionary tales about the irreversible consequences of the choices we make. Until next time, stay safe, and remember, behind every life sentence is a story of lives destroyed, not just the victims, but the perpetrators as well. This has been Cold Case Hour. Thank you for watching.